In January of 1854, a midwife in Henry County, Virginia, delivered a baby boy who would become the center of a scandal that shattered one of the state's wealthiest families. The child appeared healthy, strong lungs, good weight, dark hair. But when the doctor examined the infant's hands, he suddenly froze. The right hand carried 6 fully formed fingers, each with its own nail and knuckle moving perfectly. The 3 men waiting outside the birthing room, all claiming to be the father, stared at that extra digit as if it were a death sentence. And in many ways it truly was, because that baby had been born to a woman with skin white as bone and eyes pale as dawn, a woman who'd been purchased at a New Orleans slave auction for $4,000 and forced to become wife to 3 brothers at the same time. The 6-fingered child was supposed to secure their inheritance. Instead, it exposed a conspiracy of greed, deception, and desperation that had been poisoning the Rutland family for years. Before we discover how an albino woman became trapped in an arrangement so strange that Virginia society tried to bury all records of it, and why her 6-fingered son became the key to unraveling everything, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now, and down in the comments tell me what state or city you're listening from. I want to know where all of you dark mystery lovers are hiding. Now, let's go back to the spring of 1852, when 3 brothers made a decision that would doom them all. The Rutland plantation stretched across 800 acres of prime Virginia soil, just outside Richmond, in Henry County. Tobacco had made the family wealthy. 3 generations of careful cultivation, smart trading, and calculated marriages into prominent families. The main house stood 3 stories tall, white columns gleaming in summer heat, surrounded by oak trees older than the nation itself. Samuel Rutland was 34 when his father died that spring of 1852. As the eldest, he'd always carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who knew his place in the world. His jaw was square, his eyes the color of tobacco leaves just before harvest. He wore responsibility like tailored coats, perfectly fitted and never loosened. Thomas, at 31, was soft around the edges. He handled the plantation's finances, spent evenings bent over ledgers in the estate office. Where Samuel commanded, Thomas suggested. Where Samuel stood firm, Thomas negotiated. His hair had begun to thin at the crown, and he developed a habit of rubbing the back of his neck whenever anxious. William, the youngest at 28, had been meant for the church. He'd spent 2 years at seminary in Philadelphia before their mother's death brought him home. He still quoted scripture at dinner, still kept a Bible on his bedside table, but something in his eyes suggested his faith had developed cracks he tried not to examine. He was the tallest of the 3, with hands better suited to holding books than managing field workers. Their father's death on April 3rd changed something fundamental between them. Josiah Rutland had collapsed in the tobacco fields during an inspection, his heart simply stopping mid-sentence. He was 61 years old, and he died without saying goodbye. 3 days after they buried Josiah in the family plot, the brothers gathered for the reading of the will. Chester Hafford, the family's attorney for 12 years, sat behind the massive mahogany desk. He was 58, with silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles that caught the lamplight. He had the careful manner of a man who dealt in other people's secrets. The study smelled of old tobacco and leather. Samuel, Thomas, and William arranged themselves in chairs facing the desk, 3 men waiting to learn their futures. The first sections were standard. The plantation divided equally, assets shared in common, the workforce to remain together. Then Hafford reached the 7th clause, and his voice changed. My sons shall inherit all properties, monies shall inherit all properties, monies, and assets on the condition that they preserve the purity of the Rutland bloodline through a union that maintains our family's distinction and prevents the dilution of our heritage through common marriage. This union must be singular in nature, bound by law, yet unusual in practice, and must produce an heir within 3 years of my passing. Should this condition not be met, all assets shall be liquidated and donated to the Virginia Agricultural Society, and my sons shall receive only $300 per year. Silence filled the study. Samuel leaned forward, read that again. Hafford did, word for word. What the hell does that mean? Thomas's voice cracked, singular in nature but unusual in practice. William had gone pale. It means father wanted us to share an inheritance without dividing it. One union among 3 brothers. That's impossible, Samuel said flatly. A woman can't marry 3 men. It's not impossible, Hafford interrupted gently. Legally, 1 brother marries. Socially, the arrangement is flexible. Your father feared that dividing the plantation would destroy what he'd built. He wanted the estate to remain whole, managed by all 3 of you, bound by more than blood. You're saying he wanted us to share a wife? Thomas gripped his chair arms until his knuckles turned white. I'm saying your father wanted to ensure you worked together, that you couldn't divide the property and go separate ways. This was his solution. Samuel walked to the window. And if we refuse, then everything becomes a footnote in Virginia agricultural history. The land sold, the house belonging to strangers, the workers scattered. Hafford cleaned his spectacles. Your father believed you'd find a way. William's voice was barely audible. This is madness. This is inheritance, Hafford replied. You have 3 years to comply, or you lose everything. They sat until sunset filled the room with shadows. They discussed and argued, voices rising and falling. Samuel insisted it was impossible. Thomas calculated what they'd lose. William quoted scripture about marriage sanctity. But they all knew their decision. The plantation was worth $47,000. $300 yearly would barely support 1 brother, let alone 3. They had no choice. Over the following weeks, Hafford worked with Samuel to craft a plan. It would require discretion, careful timing, and a woman who had no choice but to comply. A woman who couldn't protest or refuse. A woman who couldn't protest or refuse. A woman who couldn't protest or refuse. A woman who had protest or refuse. That's when Hafford mentioned the upcoming auction in New Orleans and the unusual merchandise that would be available there. The journey to New Orleans took 6 days. Samuel, Thomas, and William traveled by rail and steamboat, watching Virginia's green hills give way to Louisiana's flat, humid expanse. They didn't speak much. Each brother retreated into his own justifications for what they were about to do. New Orleans in late August was a cauldron of heat and humanity. The auction house stood on Charter Street, a 2-story building with iron balconies. Inside, the air smelled of sweat and desperation, of transactions that stripped away everything except commercial value. Hafford had sent word ahead. He'd learned which auction houses dealt in the unusual, the rare, the merchandise that fetched premium prices from wealthy men looking for exotic curiosities. The brothers arrived an hour early. The holding area was divided by wooden partitions. Most potential purchasers were field workers, strong backs, and calloused hands. But in the far corner, separated by a cloth partition, stood something that made all 3 brothers stop walking. She couldn't have been more than 19. Her skin was white, not pale but white as milk, white as bone. Her hair fell in waves past her shoulders, colorless as spider silk. Her eyes, when she lifted them briefly, were the faintest pink, like the inside of certain shells. She wore a simple gray dress too large for her thin frame. Her wrists bore marks of recently removed shackles, red lines against that impossible white skin. She stood perfectly still, as if she'd learned that movement brought attention and attention brought pain. Gentlemen, this is quite a rare offering. The auctioneer appeared beside them, a portly man named Duchamp, with sweat-stained linen, pure albino, been in 3 different households since birth. Current owner settling debts, needs quick sale. She's healthy, capable of housework, speaks decent English, but I'll tell you straight, she's delicate, can't be in direct sun long, eyes sensitive to bright light. You're not buying field labor. Samuel circled her slowly the way he might examine a horse. She didn't look at him, kept her gaze on the floor. Where's she from, originally? Born on a plantation in South Carolina. Mother died in childbirth, father unknown. The condition passes through families, sometimes shows up unexpectedly. She's been taught domestic skills, Sewing, cleaning, basic cooking. Thomas stepped closer. Has she borne children? No, sir. Intact, as far as medical examination showed. Duchamp lowered his voice. Between us, gentlemen, she'd make quite a conversation piece in the right household. Imagine the talk at dinner parties. William remained several feet back, jaw clenched. But Samuel and Thomas exchanged a look that needed no words. This was exactly what they needed. Someone unusual enough to justify their father's strange clause. Someone legally powerless to refuse whatever arrangement they proposed. Someone whose very appearance would make the peculiar circumstance seem almost logical, a necessary measure to prevent such unusual traits from spreading beyond control. "What's your name?" Samuel asked her directly. She hesitated, then spoke so quietly they had to lean in. "Clara, sir." Her voice carried no accent they could identify. It was as if she'd been trained to exist without origin, without history. "Clara," Samuel repeated. "Do you understand what happens at these auctions?" "Yes, sir." "Do you have any family? Anyone who would look for you?" "No, sir." Samuel nodded. A blank slate, a person so thoroughly erased that she could be reshaped into whatever the brothers needed. The auction began at 2 o'clock. When Clara was brought to the block, the room fell into unusual hush. Even men accustomed to buying human beings stared with open curiosity. Bidding started at $1,000. Samuel raised his card immediately. A Mississippi planter jumped to $1,500. Thomas raised to $2,000. Back and forth it went, price climbing as men decided whether they wanted this unusual prize. At $3,000, most bidders dropped out. At $3,500, only two remained: the Ruttell brothers and a sugar baron from Baton Rouge. Samuel stood, making sure everyone could see his face. $4,000. The room went silent. It was an obscene amount. The sugar baron hesitated, then shook his head and sat down. Sold. Duchamp's gavel came down to the Virginia gentleman for $4,000. That's how Clara became property of the Ruttell brothers. Papers were signed, money exchanged, and she was led into brutal August sunlight that made her squint and shield her eyes. They traveled back to Virginia with their purchase. Clara sat in the rail car staring out the window, never speaking, unless spoken to. The brothers discussed their plan in low voices in the smoking car. Samuel would legally marry her as eldest and most socially prominent, but the arrangement would be explained clearly. She would live with all three brothers, would be expected to fulfill wifely duties to all three, would produce an heir that would belong to the Rutland family regardless of biological paternity. "It's biblical," William said, suddenly defensive. "Jacob had 2 wives. Abraham had Sarah and Hagar. King David had multiple wives. If we're preserving a family line, God will understand." Thomas rubbed the back of his neck. "It's not biblical marriage we're discussing. It's legal convenience wrapped in Old Testament precedents." "Then what is it about?" William demanded. Samuel answered quietly, watching tobacco fields roll past. "Survival. It's about keeping what's ours. Father understood that. The law understands that. And she'll understand it too. Or she'll learn to." They arrived at the plantation on September 2nd. The house staff had been told to prepare the guest bedroom in the west wing, the one with windows facing the garden, curtains that could block bright sunlight. Clara was taken there immediately, given water and food, left alone to adjust. That evening, all three brothers gathered in her room. Samuel did most of the talking, his voice even and businesslike. "Clara, you are here for a very specific reason. There will be a legal marriage ceremony, but you must understand that you belong to the three of us together. You will stay in this house. Everything you need will be provided. You will lack nothing material, but you will be expected to act as a wife to all three brothers. Do you understand what I am telling you?" She sat at the edge of the bed, her hands folded quietly in her lap, and nodded once. "You will address each of us as husband when we are alone. In public, you will be Mrs. Sisses as husband, when we are alone. In public you will be Mrs. Sisses, Samuel Ruttled, but you will show the same respect to Thomas and William. Your time will be shared equally between us. Your attention equally, your loyalty equally. Is that clear? She nodded again. Thomas moved closer. If you try to escape, you will be found and punished. If you tell anyone about this agreement, there will be consequences. If you fail to conceive a child within a reasonable period, we will make different arrangement. But if you cooperate, you will live comfortably, far better than anywhere else you might have gone. William said nothing. He stood by the doorway, his expression hidden by the lamplight. Clara finally spoke, her voice barely louder than a breath. When is the wedding? 2 weeks, Samuel answered. A small ceremony at the Presbyterian Church in Richmond. Only family and a few trusted associates. You will wear white. You will smile. You will say the vows. Then you will return here and begin your responsibilities. She raised her eyes to him, and for a brief second something flashed in her pale pink gaze. Fear, anger, or perhaps acceptance. The brothers could not tell. Then it faded, replaced by calm emptiness. "Yes, sir," she said softly. The brothers left her alone. As they walked down the hall, William finally spoke. "God forgive us," he whispered. Samuel's voice was cold. "God or not, this will happen. We have come too far to turn back." The wedding took place on September 16th at Richmond's Second Presbyterian Church. It was a small gathering, barely 20 guests, mostly business contacts and distant relatives, useful for maintaining reputation. Hafford attended and stood near the back, quietly observing as his carefully planned arrangement unfolded. Clara Ara wore a white dress altered by one of the house servants to fit her frame. Her hair was pinned up and covered by a lace veil that softened the startling pale tone of her skin. In the dim church interior, she looked almost unreal, like a figure from a dream. Reverend Marcus Pennington performed the ceremony. He was 64 years old and had married and buried several generations of Virginia families. He noticed that the bride never once looked directly at the groom. She spoke her vows in a flat, steady voice that showed neither happiness nor sadness, only obedience. He also noticed the 2 young men standing unusually close to the groom, their expressions matching each other, relief mixed with something darker. At the reception afterward at the plantation, Clara Ara sat quietly while guests congratulated Samuel. Men clapped him on the back while women whispered about the unusual bride. Someone asked where Samuel had found such an exotic wife, and he smiled politely and replied only that she came from excellent Carolina stock and that her distinctive appearance would ensure their children were remembered. By 10 o'clock the guests had left. The brothers and Clara Ara were alone in the house, the servants sent back to their quarters. The 4 of them stood in the main hallway, and the weight of what would come next hung heavy in the air. Samuel spoke first. "Clara, we begin tonight. You will come to my room tomorrow night, Thomas's room, the night after William's. We will rotate like that. Simple and fair. Do you understand?" She nodded again with the same mechanical acceptance. "Any questions?" She looked at each of them slowly, studying their faces as if memorizing every detail for some future purpose. Then she asked the one question that seemed to matter. "After I have a child, what happens then?" The brothers exchanged glances. Samuel answered carefully. "Then you will have fulfilled your primary duty. The rest we will decide later." It was not truly an answer, and Clara Ara knew it, but she did not argue. She followed Samuel up the stairs, her white dress trailing behind her like a pale shadow. The arrangement continued for months. Clara Ara moved between the brothers' rooms like an object being shifted to maintain balance. During the day she was Mrs. Samuel Ruttled, managing the household, overseeing staff, appearing beside her husband when business associates visited. She learned when to smile, how to speak about weather or gardens, how to exist as the wife of a respected Virginia gentleman. At night, she belonged equally to 3 men who had purchased her like property and expected her to produce their future through a child. The brothers kept their routine for 8 months. Samuel treated the arrangement like business, efficient and practical. Thomas was gentler, sometimes apologetic, occasionally attempting conversation, as if words might soften the situation. William recited scripture before and after, as though holy words could justify their actions. Then in May of 1853, Clara Ara missed her monthly courses. By June, the house physician confirmed what everyone suspected. She was pregnant. The brothers celebrated with expensive bourbon in the study, toasting their success and their secured inheritance. Hafford was summoned and informed that the first requirement of the will had been fulfilled. He recorded everything carefully in his leather journal and assured them that as long as Clara Ara delivered a healthy child, their future was safe. Clara Ara herself said nothing when told of the pregnancy. She only nodded and continued her routine, sometimes resting a hand on her still flat stomach, as if uncertain that something was truly growing there. The pregnancy progressed normally through summer into fall. Clara Ara grew rounder and moved more slowly, pending long hours in the garden where she sat in the shade, watching butterflies drift between flowers. The brothers became attentive to her health, ensuring she had the finest food, the most comfortable chairs, every possible comfort. Yet beneath the calm surface, something was changing. Clara Ara began asking questions about the plantation's finances. She requested books from Thomas's library and read late into the evening by lamplight. She learned the names of all 37 enslaved people on the property, something none of the brothers had done. She watched and listened carefully, and behind those pale eyes, quiet calculations seemed to form. On January 9th, 1854, after 14 hours of labor attended by the same physician who confirmed the pregnancy, Clara Ara gave birth to a son. The child was healthy, with dark hair and strong lungs that filled the room with sound. The doctor cleaned the baby, wrapped him in soft cloth, and prepared to place him in the mother's arms. Then he noticed the hands. The baby had 6 fingers on his right hand, a fully formed extra digit growing from the side of his palm, complete with nail and joint. The doctor paused, staring in surprise. He looked at Clara Ara, whose face had gone even paler, then at the 3 brothers gathered near the bed. Samuel reached the child first. He pulled back the cloth and counted the fingers twice, as if the 6th might disappear if he looked hard enough. "What is this?" he asked quietly. The doctor cleared his throat. "It is called polydactyly, sir. Extra digits. Not extremely rare. It appears in some families or sometimes happens without warning. The finger looks fully formed and functional. It is not harmful. It is a mark." William interrupted, his face drained of color. "A mark of sin, of impure blood." I. T is a genetic variation," the doctor said firmly. "Nothing more. Many healthy people live with extra fingers. It can be removed surgically if you wish, but there is no medical necessity." "Get out," Samuel said sharply. "Leave the child and go." The doctor handed the baby to Clara Ara, gathered his instruments and left quickly. The brothers stood at the foot of the bed, staring at the infant nursing quietly, at the extra finger that seemed to challenge everything they had planned. Thomas spoke first, his voice trembling. "Which of us do you think? Does it matter?" Samuel replied bitterly. "The child is marked and strange, just like her." Clara Ara lifted her gaze from the baby, and for the first time since arriving at the plantation, spoke without waiting to be addressed. Her voice was calm and steady. "He is your heir. Your father's requirement was an heir within 3 years. Here, he is. You received what you wanted." "We wanted a flawless heir," Samuel replied sharply. "Not something that will make people whisper, that will raise doubts about purity." Clara's laugh was sharp and without humor, about bloodlines, about protecting family distinction. "Look at what your father's obsession produced. Look at what you 3 have created. You wanted something unusual, and unusual is exactly what you received." The brothers had no answer. They walked out one by one, leaving Clara alone with the 6-fingered baby, who would either secure or destroy their inheritance. For 3 days, the brothers argued behind closed doors. William insisted the child's condition was a sign of God's displeasure. Thomas calculated probabilities, trying to determine which of them might carry a genetic predisposition to polydactyly. Samuel focused on practical matters, whether the child's condition would affect the inheritance, whether they could keep it hidden, whether surgical removal would be safe. On the fourth day, Hafford arrived after receiving an urgent message. He examined the baby carefully, wrote notes, then gave his conclusion. Your father's will specifies an heir. It does not specify a perfect heir. This child fulfills the legal requirement. However, he paused, choosing his words with care. The unusual nature of his condition may raise questions about paternity, about bloodlines, about whether the Ruttled family genetics are as pure as your father believed. Such questions could complicate future business dealings, social reputation, and marriage prospects for the child. So what do we do? Samuel demanded. You do nothing. Hafford closed his journal slowly. You register the birth. You name the child. You present him as your son and heir. If anyone asks about the finger, you say it is a harmless variation that runs in Carolina families, something inherited from the mother's side. You make it sound ordinary, unimportant, and you hope that no one looks too closely at any other aspect of your domestic arrangement. They named the baby Josiah after his grandfather. The extra finger remained. The doctor advised against surgery on such a young infant, and secretly each brother feared that removing it might somehow invalidate the inheritance. Clara recovered from the birth slowly. She moved through the house like a shadow, the baby always in her arms, or nearby, in his cradle. She had stopped rotating between the brothers' bedrooms. There was no longer any reason for that particular arrangement, and none of them pushed the issue. She settled in the nursery, sleeping in a small bed near the baby's cradle, effectively separating herself from the brothers, while still living under their roof. The months following the birth were filled with a strange, tense peace. The plantation continued its operations. Tobacco was planted and harvested. The baby grew stronger, and the brothers tried to pretend everything was normal. But Clara was changing. The blank acceptance that had defined her first year was gone. She had begun to assert small acts of rebellion, refusing certain social gatherings, insisting on making decisions about the baby's care without consulting the brothers, spending hours in Thomas's library, reading law books and historical texts. And she started asking questions. Questions about the plantation's finances. Questions about her legal status as Samuel's wife. Questions about her legal status as Samuel's wife. Questions about what would happen to her and the baby if anything happened to the brothers. Thomas, who still managed the estate's accounts, tried to deflect her inquiries. But Clara was persistent, and she had learned that patience was a weapon that could be used with devastating precision. What none of the brothers realized was that Clara had also begun corresponding with someone. Letters arrived at the plantation addressed to Mrs. Samuel Ruttled. Letters that Clara collected from the house staff before anyone else could see them. She read these letters in private, then burned them in the nursery fireplace, watching the papers curl and darken as if erasing evidence of a crime not yet committed. The writer of these letters was Josiah Ruttled's brother, Martin Ruttled, who had been noticeably absent from the wedding and all later family gatherings. Martin had his own plantation in North Carolina, his own fortune built on tobacco and cotton, and Martin had his own opinions about his brother's unusual will, opinions he had kept carefully silent until now. In October of 1854, 1 year and 8 months after Clara had become part of the Ruttled household, a visitor arrived at the plantation. He came on horseback, well-dressed, with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to authority. He asked to speak with Samuel Ruttled on urgent family business. The visitor was Martin Ruttled's attorney, a man named Silas Corbett, and he carried documents that would unravel everything the brothers believed they had secured. But that revelation was still weeks away. For now, Corbett simply introduced himself, accepted refreshments, and mentioned casually that he would be staying in Richmond for a few days attending to business matters. Samuel showed him every courtesy, never suspecting that his uncle had just made the first move in a game far more complicated than 3 brothers trying to satisfy their father's will, never suspecting that Clara had been laying the groundwork for this moment since the day she gave birth to a 6-fingered baby and realized that her unusual child might be either her chain or her key to freedom. The evening after Corbett's visit, Clara stood at her window overlooking the tobacco fields, the baby sleeping peacefully in his cradle behind her. She touched the glass with one pale finger, leaving a small mark in the condensation. Through the blurred spot she could see lights in the overseer's cottage, in the curing barns, in the distant slave quarters. So many lives intertwined on this land, all controlled by three men who believed they had secured their future by purchasing a white-skinned girl at a New Orleans auction. Clara smiled then, a small, cold smile that held no joy, and whispered something too quiet for anyone to hear. But if the words could have been captured, they might have been, "Let us see how pure your bloodline really is, gentlemen." And Silas Corbett returned to the Ruttled plantation on October 23rd. This time he came with more than pleasantries. He arrived with a leather portfolio containing documents that Samuel, Thomas, and William would find deeply troubling. The brothers met him in Josiah's old study. Corbett spread papers across the desk with the careful precision of a man building a legal case. "Gentlemen, I will be direct because my client, Martin Ruttled, values directness. There are significant irregularities in your father's will. My client has reason to believe that certain provisions may have been altered or added after the original document was executed." Samuel became very still. "That is a serious accusation, Mr. Corbett. Our father's will was properly witnessed, properly filed by Chester Hafford." "Yes, but were you aware that Hafford and Martin Ruttled had a falling out 3 years before Josiah's death over a failed business deal? Were you aware that Hafford lost nearly $7,000 in a cotton speculation that Martin refused to support? Were you aware that your father's signature on certain pages of the will does not fully match his signature on other legal documents from the same period?" Thomas's hand moved to the back of his neck, rubbing nervously. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting that Martin Ruttled has questions about the validity of certain testamentary provisions, particularly the unusual clause regarding marriage and heirs. Martin believes the clause was inserted by Hafford after Josiah's death as a means of controlling you three, and more importantly, controlling the flow of money from the estate." William leaned forward. "Controlling money? How?" Corbett pulled out another document. "This is a ledger from Hafford's law office, obtained through certain channels that I will not specify. It shows regular payments from the Ruttled estate to Hafford's accounts, payments well above his normal legal fees, payments labeled as estate management and inheritance administration. Over the past 18 months he has withdrawn nearly $11,000. The number hung heavily in the air. Samuel's jaw tightened. "Thomas, is that accurate?" Thomas had gone pale. "There have been payments to Hafford for managing the legal complexities of the inheritance, for filing paperwork, but $11,000 in 18 months. Samuel's voice rose. "For paperwork," Corbett continued, his tone measured and professional. "Martin Ruttled believes that Chester Hafford orchestrated this entire situation, that he inserted the marriage clause, knowing you would be desperate to comply, knowing it would require ongoing legal management, knowing he could slowly drain the estate while keeping you focused on satisfying an impossible condition. And he may not have been working alone." "What do you mean?" William's voice was barely audible. "I mean that Martin Ruttled has been investigating your father's final months. Josiah was in excellent health, according to his physician in Richmond. Then suddenly in March of 1852 he began complaining of fatigue, irregular heartbeat, and dizzy spells. He died 5 weeks later. The physician attributed it to natural decline, heart failure brought on by age. But Martin has spoken with household staff from that period. Several mentioned that Josiah's meals were often delivered to him in his study by Chester Hafford, who visited frequently during those final weeks. The implication was clear. Samuel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You are accusing Hafford of murder, of poisoning our father." "I am." Sigh. There are questions that deserve answers. Martin is prepared to challenge the will in court. But before he does, he wanted to extend an offer to you three. Work with him to investigate Hafford, help expose whatever scheme is operating here, and Martin will ensure the plantation remains in family hands, properly divided among all 4 nephews. Refuse, and Martin files his challenge tomorrow. Either way, the truth will come out. Samuel paced toward the window. Behind him, Thomas was frantically calculating numbers in his head. William had his head in his hands, probably praying for guidance that would not come. "We need time," Samuel finally said. "Time to review our records, too." "You have 3 days," Corbett interrupted. "Martin is not a patient man, and the longer this continues, the more money disappears." 3 days, gentlemen. Then I need your answer." After Corbett left, the brothers remained in the study for hours. They pulled every ledger Thomas had kept, every record of transactions with Hafford, searching for details they might have overlooked, each of them silently wondering whether the foundation of their inheritance had been built on deception from the very beginning. The pattern became clearer. Hafford had been steadily overcharging for services, inventing fictional legal expenses, billing for work that was never actually performed. But the payments had been small enough, spread out enough that Thomas had never questioned them one by one. Only when viewed together did they reveal the true scale of the theft. "He played us," Thomas said, his voice hollow and tired. "From the moment Father died, he played us." Samuel slammed his hand down on the desk. "The will. We need to examine the will itself. Get the original from the courthouse." But there was a problem. The original will was kept in Hafford's office safe, as was customary for a state document still under active administration. The courthouse only held a certified copy, a copy that Hafford himself had filed. "We could break into his office," William suggested, then looked shocked by his own words. "I mean, if we need the original, we need Clara," Samuel said suddenly. Both brothers stared at him. "Think about it. Corbett knows things about the household that he should not know, things about Father's final months, about meals delivered, about Hafford's visits. How would Martin know any of that? He was not here, but Clara Ara was. Clara Ara has been here for 2 years, watching everything, listening to the servants' gossip, asking questions." "You think she has been feeding information to Martin?" Thomas interrupted. "I think she is smarter than we gave her credit for, and I think she has been looking for a way out since the day we brought her here." They found Clara Ara in the nursery, as always. Little Josiah was 14 months old now, beginning to walk, babbling sounds that might someday become words. He was beautiful despite, or perhaps because of, his unusual hand. Clara Ara had refused to let anyone suggest removing the extra finger, had defended it fiercely any time the subject came up. The 3 brothers entered without knocking. Clara Ara looked up from where she sat, reading to the baby, her expression carefully neutral. Samuel spoke first. "We had a visitor today, Silas Corbett. He works for my Uncle Martin. He knows things about this household that he should not know. So I will ask you directly, have you been corresponding with Martin Ruttold?" Clara Ara set the book down carefully. "I have been corresponding with several people. I am a married woman. I am permitted to send and receive letters." "Do not play games," Samuel warned. "Have you been giving information to Martin?" "I have been seeking legal advice, as is my right given my unusual situation." Thomas stepped forward. "Clara Ara, if you are helping Martin challenge the will, you are destroying your own security. If the inheritance is divided among 4 people instead of 3, there is less for everyone, including you and the baby." Clara Ara smiled then, and it was not the blank, compliant expression they had grown used to. It was sharp and knowing. "You really do not understand, do you? I have no security. I never did. I am property that you dressed up in a wedding gown. I have no legal standing, no rights, no claim to anything except what you 3 choose to give me. And if you all died tomorrow, I would be right back where I started, auctioned off to whoever wanted to pay. The baby would be taken away, raised by strangers, and I would have nothing. You think I care about your inheritance problems? You think I want to preserve what you built here?" The truth of her words hit them like cold water. They had never truly considered what would happen to Clara if their arrangement collapsed. William found his voice. "What did you tell Martin?" "I told him the truth, that your father was healthy until he suddenly was not. That Chester Hafford visited constantly during those final weeks. That Hafford has been taking money from the estate. That you three have been so focused on satisfying a strange will provision that you never stopped to ask if that provision was legitimate. I told him everything because Martin promised me something none of you ever did. My freedom and my son's future. Samuel's face turned dark red. You betrayed us. Betrayed you. Clara Erra's laugh was bitter. You bought me. You forced me to share a bed with 3 different men. You impregnated me and then were disappointed that the baby was not perfect enough. And you call it betrayal when I try to find a way out. I call it survival. The room fell silent except for little Josiah making soft noises as he played with wooden blocks. The extra finger on his right hand worked just as well as the other 5, grasping and releasing with the innocent focus of a child who did not yet know he was different. Thomas spoke quietly. What did Martin promise you exactly? If the will is overturned, if Hafford is exposed, Martin will give me $3,000 and legal documents granting me and Josiah freedom. We can go anywhere, start again, live as free people. All I had to do was tell the truth about what I have observed here. $3,000, Samuel repeated. That is less than we paid for you. But it is mine. Mine and my son's. Not dependent on satisfying your father's conditions or maintaining your family's precious bloodline. It is freedom, Samuel. Something you have never had to think about because you were born with it. Before Samuel could respond, there was a knock at the nursery door. One of the house servants, an older woman named Ruth, who had been with the family for 30 years, entered hesitantly. Pardon, Mr. Samuel, but there is something you need to see in the master study right away, sir. The brothers followed Ruth downstairs, leaving Clara Ara alone with the baby. When they entered the study, they found Chester Hafford standing by the desk, his face pale and strained. How did you get in here? Samuel demanded. I still have keys to this house. I helped your father build this estate. I drafted his will. I have managed his affairs for 12 years. And now I am here to tell you that you need to stop Martin's investigation immediately. Why would we do that? Thomas asked coldly. You have been stealing from us. Hafford's composure cracked slightly. I have not been stealing. I have been surviving. You think your father left you a fortune. He left you a shell. A beautiful, impressive shell with almost nothing inside. The 3 brothers froze. Hafford continued, words tumbling out quickly. Your father was a gambler, gentlemen. Not in the social sense. Not cards at parties. He gambled on cotton futures, on rail speculation, on every risky investment that came along. He lost money for years, and he covered it by taking loans against the plantation. By the time he died, this estate was mortgaged to 3 different banks. The tobacco crops barely covered interest payments. The fortune you think you inherited never existed anymore. Samuel's voice was dangerous. You are lying. I have the loan documents. I have the bank statements. I have been working for 2 years to keep this estate afloat, to make payments, to juggle creditors, those excessive fees I have been charging. That money went to banks to keep them from foreclosing. I have been saving your inheritance, not stealing it. Thomas collapsed into a chair. How much do we owe? $37,000, give or take. Nearly the entire value of the property. William looked like he might be sick. That is impossible. Father was careful. He was desperate. Hafford interrupted. After your mother died, he became convinced he was going to lose everything. He took bigger risks, chased bigger returns, and lost bigger sums. That clause in the will about preserving the bloodline was not about family unity. It was about making sure you 3 stayed together, pooled your resources, worked as one unit to pay off his debts. He knew that if you divided the property, if you went your separate ways, the banks would foreclose, and the Ruttled name would be destroyed. The study was silent. Outside, the autumn sun was setting, painting tobacco fields in shades of gold and amber, beautiful and bankrupt. Samuel finally spoke. Does Martin know about the debt? Not yet, but he will, the moment he subpoenas bank records, and when he does, he will realize that challenging the will means getting a share of a massive debt, not a fortune. He will walk away, and the banks will move in, and everything your family built over 4 generations will be auctioned off to pay creditors. So what do we do? William's voice was barely above a whisper. Hafford straightened slightly. We do what your father intended. We work together, all of us, to save what can be saved. I continue managing the estate, making payments, negotiating with banks. You 3 keep the plantation running, keep producing crops, keep generating income. And Clara needs to be convinced that her best interest lies in maintaining the current situation. She wants freedom, Thomas said. Then we give her a reason to stay. We draw up papers, real papers, legal papers, that grant her and the child certain protections. A trust fund for the boy. A guarantee that if anything happens to you, 3, she receives a percentage of whatever remains. Make her a partner in survival, instead of an enemy. The door opened suddenly. Clara Ara stood there. Little Josiah balanced on her hip. She must have been listening from the hallway because her expression showed she had heard everything. So the great rattled fortune is a lie, she said quietly. The inheritance you bought me to secure does not even exist. Hafford turned toward her. Mrs. Ruttled, the situation is more complicated. Do not, Clara Ara cut him off. Do not try to spin this. You all used, all of you. Josiah used his sons. The sons used me. You used everyone. And now you want me to stay silent and compliant so this house of cards does not collapse. I want you to make a rational choice, Hafford replied. If Martin's challenge succeeds, you get $3,000 in freedom, but no home, no security beyond that single payment, and a child who will grow up knowing his father's family was destroyed by scandal and debt. If the estate survives, I will ensure you and Josiah have legal protections, income, a future. It is not freedom, but it is survival. Clara looked at each of them in turn. Then she looked at her son, at his bright eyes and his 6-fingered hand, and something in her expression shifted slightly. I want papers drawn up by tomorrow. Papers that put a trust fund of $5,000 in Josiah's name, untouchable by any of you. Papers that grant me legal ownership of the west wing of this house. Papers that clearly state that if any of you 3 dies, I receive 1/3 of whatever estate remains, and I want Chester Hafford removed as estate manager. Thomas will take over all financial decisions with oversight from an independent attorney that I choose. Hafford opened his mouth to argue, but Samuel raised his hand. Done. All of it. Clara Ara studied him carefully. And you will stop the rotation arrangement. I will not share bedrooms with any of you anymore. That part of this farce is finished. Agreed. Then I will tell Martin to withdraw his challenge. I will write to him personally and explain that the fam, Illy, has resolved its disputes. But understand this, if any of you breaks these terms, if you attempt to cheat me or my son out of what has been promised, I will burn this plantation to the ground before I allow you to profit from it. Are we understood? The 3 brothers nodded slowly. They had no real choice. Clara Rara now held all the leverage. After she left, Hafford slumped against the desk. I never intended for it to go this far. While profiting quite well, Samuel said dryly, while earning fair payment for work no one else wanted to do. But yes, I profited. We all did what we had to do to survive, including her. The tobacco crop of 1855 began with promise. Good rains arrived in early spring. Warm days helped the plants grow strong. By May, the fields were a sea of wide green leaves, and for the first time in months, the brothers allowed themselves to feel hope. Then the weather changed. June brought heat, unlike anything the region had seen for years. Temperatures rose into the high 90s day after day. The tobacco plants wilted despite watering, their leaves curling at the edges. When rain finally came in mid-July, it arrived with violent storms that turned fields into mud and flattened plants. Thomas calculated the numbers in early August and delivered the verdict. They would lose around 40% of their expected crop value. It was a disaster that pushed them from unstable to critical. The bank payments due in October could not be made without selling assets. Samuel called a meeting in the study on August 12. Present were Thomas, William, Chester Hafford, and Clara Ara, who had been invited specifically at Samuel's insistence. "We need capital," Samuel announced without introduction. $20,000 by October, or the First Bank of Richmond calls in our main loan. If that happens, everything collapses. Hafford spoke first. "I have approached contacts about additional loans, but no one will extend credit without collateral." "What about the workers?" Thomas interrupted quietly. "We have 37 people. If we sold 10, Clara Ara's voice turned cold as ice. "You are discussing selling human beings like livestock. In front of me, a woman you purchased, like livestock. We are discussing survival," Samuel replied sharply. William stood abruptly, swaying slightly. "This is wrong. All of it. We are corrupted by Father's greed, by our own pride. We should confess everything. Throw ourselves on the mercy of the church. Let God decide." "God is not paying our bank loans," Samuel said coldly. "Sit down, William." "No." William's voice rose louder now, slurred with drink and desperation. "I am finished. I am going to Richmond tomorrow. I am going to tell the truth about Father's will, about the debt, about everything. Let it all burn." The room fell silent. Samuel stood slowly. "You will destroy us," Samuel said quietly. "We are already destroyed." Samuel crossed the room in 3 quick strides and struck his younger brother. It was not a slap. It was a punch thrown with full force, connecting with William's jaw and sending him sprawling backward. Books fell down around him as he collapsed to the floor, blood running from his split lip. "Samuel." Thomas moved between them, but Samuel pushed him aside. "He does not get to destroy what I have worked to save." William touched his bleeding mouth, staring up at his brother. "You have become father. You have become exactly what he was, willing to sacrifice anything, anyone, to protect the family name. Someone has to be willing to make hard choices." Clara's voice cut through the tension. "There might be another option, one you have not considered." All eyes turned toward her. "I have been thinking about our shared predicament. I believe I have a solution." She paused. "Chester, you said no one will extend credit without collateral, but that is not entirely accurate. No one will extend credit to the Ruttled brothers without collateral, but I am not a Ruttled brother. I am a woman with certain legal protections and a trust fund that was recently established." Hafford leaned forward. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting that I borrow money against my trust fund and my legal claim to part of the estate. I go to banks in Richmond, perhaps banks in North Carolina, where Martin Ruttled has connections. I present myself as a woman trying to secure her son's future. It is unconventional, but not impossible." Thomas shook his head slowly. "No bank would loan that kind of money to a woman. They might, if I had a co-signer. Someone with good credit. Someone not connected to the Ruttled family debt. Someone like Martin Ruttled, for example." The implication landed heavily. Samuel's eyes narrowed. "You want to bring Martin back into this?" "I want to save this plantation because, if it fails, my son and I lose everything too. Martin still believes there might be value here if properly managed. If I approach him, explain that I am trying to protect Josiah's inheritance, ask for his help as family, he might co-sign a loan, especially if we offer him 10% of future profits for 5 years." It was brilliant, and they all knew it. Clara would assume debt, but the estate would get the capital it needed. Martin would get profitable return without risk, and the brothers would keep their plantation, at least temporarily. But it also meant giving Clara even more power. Samuel studied her carefully. "Why would you do this? What is in it for you?" Clara met his gaze calmly. "I want your promise, all 3 of your promises witnessed and legally binding, that when the debts are paid, when the estate is stable, you will grant me and Josiah complete freedom. Legal documents declaring us free persons with the trust fund intact, and the West Wing property transferred fully into my ownership. I want to know that this nightmare has an end date. And if we refuse, then William goes to Richmond tomorrow and tells his truth. The banks call their loans. The plantation fails. And we all walk away with nothing. The brothers exchanged looks. Thomas finally spoke. We agree. No. Clarera's voice was firm. Daniel Thorne drafts the documents. Your family attorney is too compromised. I want my attorney handling this, with copies filed in 3 different courthouses. Over the next 2 days, Clara traveled to Richmond with Daniel Thorne, met with Martin Ruttold, and presented her proposal. Martin, intrigued by profit without risk, agreed to co-sign the loan. By the end of August, Clara had secured $25,000. She returned to the plantation with bank drafts and a small, satisfied smile that suggested she understood exactly how much power she now held. The immediate crisis passed, but the balance of power had shifted completely. Clara was no longer a purchased woman. She was a creditor, a business partner, the person who had saved the plantation when the 3 brothers could not. Fall turned into winter, winter into spring. The 1856 tobacco crop was planted with hope, born from desperation. But something else was happening that year. Political tensions between northern and southern states were rising. Arguments about slavery, about states' rights, about the future of the nation were becoming impossible to ignore. William, who had becoming impossible to ignore. William, who had becoming increasingly withdrawn after Samuel's assault, spent hours listening to political debates in Richmond taverns. He came home one evening in April and announced that war was coming, that it was inevitable. Your religious crisis is not our concern, Samuel said wearily. We have real problems. But William would not let it go. He started preaching to the workers in the evenings, holding prayer meetings in the tobacco barns, speaking about redemption and judgment. Samuel ordered him to stop. William ignored the order. The conflict between the 2 brothers grew throughout the spring. By June, they were barely speaking. Just when we thought we had seen it all, the horror in Henry County intensified. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And do not forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The spring of 1857 arrived with better weather and a hopeful tobacco crop growing across the fields. The brothers slowly allowed themselves to relax a little. Thomas's calculations suggested that if the harvest sold well, they could reduce a large part of their debt before the year ended. Then on August 9th, 1857, William Ruttold disappeared without warning. He was last seen on the evening of August 8th, walking toward the tobacco barns. After supper, Ruth said he looked troubled, had been drinking more than usual, and had whispered something about redemption and truth. When he failed to come to breakfast, Thomas went to his bedroom and found it empty. The bed had not been slept in. William's Bible was gone. Samuel organized a search at once. They found nothing at all. No signs of struggle. No clear clue about where William might have gone. He had simply vanished without a trace. On August 10th, a letter arrived from Richmond. It was addressed to Samuel and written in William's handwriting. Samuel read it aloud, his voice steady but tense. Brother, by the time you read this, I will have done what should have been done 2 years ago. I have gone to the Richmond presbyter and confessed everything. Father's debt, Hafford's manipulation, the arrangement with Clara, all of it. I have given them copies of financial documents that I removed from Thomas's office. I told them about purchasing a human being to satisfy a false interpretation of a will. I exposed us, Samuel, because we deserve to be exposed. I am leaving Virginia. Where I go, I will not say, but I will spend the rest of my life seeking God's forgiveness. I pray you find your own redemption before it is too late. Your brother, William. Silence filled the study. Thomas turned pale. He's destroyed us, Thomas whispered. The door suddenly burst open. Chester Hafford stood there breathing heavily, holding a newspaper in his hand. You need to see this. Richmond Inquirer morning edition. He spread the newspaper across the desk. On the 3rd page, the headline mentioned that esteemed attorney Chester Hafford was being questioned about an estate fraud allegation. The Richmond presbyter had referred questions to a civil magistrate regarding claims made by Mr. William Ruttold of Henrio County. Mr. Ruttold alleged systematic fraud in the administration of the Josiah Ruttold estate, including accusations of forgery, embezzlement, and manipulation of testamentary documents. Investigation ongoing. Hafford dropped into a chair. Bad T. The magistrate is Cornelius Vaughan. He is careful, honest, and very thorough. If he begins pulling bank records and examining the will closely, we may only have 2 weeks. The investigation lasted 6 weeks. Magistrate Vaughan interviewed everyone: the brothers, Clara, house servants, field workers, and business partners. He examined the will with 3 handwriting experts. He subpoenaed bank records from 4 separate institutions. What he discovered was damaging, though not exactly what William had claimed. The will was genuine. Josiah's signature was real and properly witnessed, but the interpretation Hafford had given was intentionally misleading. The clause about preserving the family line through unusual union was never meant as a literal command. It was Josiah's bitter poetic language, his way of saying his sons needed to work together rather than divide the property. Any skilled attorney would have recognized it as symbolic, but Hafford had seen opportunity. He convinced 3 desperate brothers that their father demanded an impossible arrangement and guided them through creating it. He used their obedience to justify enormous fees, draining an estate already drowning in debt. On October 3rd, 1857, Magistrate Vaughan issued his findings. Chester Hafford was charged with fraud and embezzlement. He was disbarred, fined $12,000, and sentenced to 3 years in prison. He died of apoplexy 18 months into his sentence. The Ruttold brothers were cleared of criminal wrongdoing because the magistrate concluded they had been manipulated by their attorney. Clara Ara's marriage to Samuel remained legally valid, but the publicity destroyed them socially. Every prominent family in Virginia read about the investigation, the purchased bride, 3 brothers Shah, ring 1 woman, a 6-fingered hair, and a fortune built on lies. Invitations stopped coming. Business partners withdrew. The Ruttold name became linked with scandal and shame. Thomas handled the fallout the worst. Learning that his careful management had been built on false foundations broke something inside him. He began drinking heavily and stopped keeping proper records. On a cold morning in January 1858, Ruth found him in his bedroom dead from what the physician called heart failure, though everyone believed it was despair. Samuel buried his brother and tried to continue, but the 1857 crop had been damaged by the investigation. Buyers did not want tobacco associated with scandal. Prices fell sharply. Debts increased. By the spring of 1858, Samuel knew everything was ending. He met with Clara in the study. One final evening in March, "The plantation will be auctioned to pay creditors," he said in a flat voice. "Your trust fund should be protected, and your legal claim may give you 3,000 or 4,000 after the banks take their share. I'm sorry, we tried." Clara looked at him across the desk. "Did you ever love her? Your mother?" The question caught Samuel off guard. "What?" "I am trying to understand how a family reaches this point, how love becomes a transaction, how children become pieces in a game." Samuel stayed silent for a long time. "My father loved my mother, I think. But when she died, something inside him died too. He became obsessed with legacy and permanence. He forgot that families are made of people, not property. And you." "I became him." Exactly what William said. Samuel walked to the window slowly. "I do not know where my younger brother went or if he found peace, but he was right to run. This place is cursed by ambition and greed." The auction happened on April 2nd, 1858. Everything went under the hammer. Land, buildings, equipment, livestock, and 37 human beings were sold to different buyers and scattered across Virginia. The house sold for $12,000. The land brought less than expected. After banks and creditors were paid, Clara received $4,300 and legal ownership of furniture from the West Wing. Daniel Thorne had prepared documents granting her and Josiah official freedom. Samuel took his share, barely $900, and disappeared. Some claimed he went west to California. Others said he drank himself to death in a boarding house in Baltimore. No one knew for certain. Clara left Virginia in May 1858. She took 4-year-old Josiah, her settlement money, and Ruth, whose freedom she purchased, with $500. The three traveled to Philadelphia, where Clara had written to a Quaker community that helped former slaves build new lives. She never married again. She opened a small shop selling fabrics and sewing supplies, raising Josiah to be nothing like his father, grandfather, or uncles. She taught him that the six-fingered hand he was born with was not a mark of corruption, but simply a natural variation. Josiah grew up in Philadelphia, attended school, and learned his mother's trade. That extra finger gave him unusual dexterity with small tools. He became a skilled jeweler, known for intricate work others found impossible. He married a teacher from Boston, had 3 children, and never returned to Virginia. Clara lived to the age of 62. During her final weeks, bedridden with pneumonia, she told Josiah the complete story of his origins. The auction house, the forced arrangement, the fraudulent interpretation of the will, everything. She,